It's the bird emergency. I'm Grant Williams. I am not a scientist, but I have been an applied scientist in horticulture. So that makes me what I like to call a pretend scientist. Now, it's World Parrot Day, depending on who you believe. And I wanted to do something special to mark World Parrot Day this year. And I reckon I've cracked it. I've got Dr. Kakapo, Dr. Andrew Digby, the man who speaks for all Kakapo. Now you're the scientific is it director of the recovery team?
Advisor, yeah, Kia ora, Grant. Yeah, so I'm the scientific advisor for Kakapo and for Takahei actually as well. So I kind of lead all the science work for these species, and I'm just a small cog. There's a lot of people involved in these species, and just within our group, and also external as well. So
yeah, I think that's something I'll always like to push out there, that even though you might be the public figurehead, there's an awful lot of people knocking in posts, getting signs organised, driving equipment around. Are you still doing the food stations for the Kakapo?
Yeah, we are. We do that in the breeding season. Yep. And there's a lot of lucky rangers with their boots on out in the field. So that's always it's always where we all want to be.
That's right. So let's make sure we are recognising everyone who's working on that. And Andrew, are most of the people involved in the effort volunteers, or are most of you DOC, Department of Conservation staff?
Yeah, so we have a core group of Department of Conservation staff, and it roughly sits around about 15. But it swells during a breeding season. We recruit people on sort of short-term contracts. But we do use volunteers quite a lot in the breeding season, so they're a key part of it. So we get people from all around the world coming in to help. But yeah, most of the time, day to day, especially outside of breeding seasons, it's our core Department of Conservation team.
And do you do a lot of partnerships with universities, with people coming in and doing postdoc work or anything like that, or is most of the research work centralised through the department?
Yeah, actually, most of it is external. So that's a key part of my job, is basically finding people around the world who are kind of experts in their field and working with them on the problems that we have. And that's a really exciting part of the job. And we're lucky with Kakapo. People might not have heard of them, but they kind of often get excited about working with Kakapo. So we don't really have a shortage of people wanting to work with these birds. And yeah, we work with people in completely different fields. I've been working recently with a lot of people who are not in conservation or wildlife at all, just in human health, for example. So with some of our disease issues, and that's really cool to just get that real cross-fertilization and that cross-disciplinary work across completely different fields.
Well, as somebody who sits across the ditch, for international listeners, that's what we call the Tasman Sea, separating Australia and New Zealand. So that's across the ditch. The two main issues for the Kakapo are the predation that has historically occurred, and that has, along with human hunting, has reduced the numbers, hence the genetic pool. And the other thing is a health. Are we talking about a disease, or are we talking about a condition, which is the other major threat?
Yeah, so we have a couple. There's disease is a real issue for us, definitely. There's a couple of diseases, one in particular called cloacidus or crusty bum, which is one that's been rumbling on for a long time. And it's not super deadly, but it will kill birds if left untreated. We know how to treat it, but we don't know what causes it. So that's one that we're really focusing on. And also there's aspergillosis, which is a fungal pneumonia. And that wasn't a problem until a couple of years ago, when in the breeding season in 2019, it really reared its head and we had a big outbreak. So they're the disease issues. And I guess I'll also add the other issue, that probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest for Kakapo, is the infertility. There's a really low fertility rate for Kakapo. So that's what we're always fighting against.
Well, let's sort of go through them one at a time. The respiratory disease issue, that seems to be something that is just common in birds in certain situations. So what are the factors that are driving that infestation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we're still trying to understand it. But it is common in captive birds. It's common in sort of zoos and aquariums, that sort of thing, with penguins, and just a lot of different species of birds. It's not been a problem in kakapo before. We've had one case in 2012 before 2019, so we had one bird die of it, and then suddenly we had a big outbreak. And we think it's accumulation of things. In particular, that was a really warm, dry year, unusually warm and unusually dry. And some of the fungal species of Aspergillus actually really like those sort of conditions. It only affected the females and the chicks that are in nests, so in those confined spaces. And we've done a lot of genetic work, and we've been working with a lot of teams from around the world who investigate Aspergillus because it's a big human health issue as well. And it seems like it's quite an unusual strain which we've picked up on our Kakapo Islands. So it might have been a combination of a really climatic conditions were really suitable for it, and we've kind of got this pathogenic strain which has caused a lot of issues. Yeah, so that was a kind of interesting time. We had a massive effort with a lot of people around New Zealand and around the world to try and pull together and solve this problem. And now we're trying to understand exactly what caused it and to try and stop it happening again.
Is it common or is it occurring in all of the sites where you are monitoring the kakapo?
No, and that's a real key thing. It's only occurred on one island, on an island called Whenua or Codfish Island. The actual fungus we found on another island too, but it didn't cause disease there. It only caused disease on the one, which makes us a little bit suspicious that it could possibly be there's something else involved, some environmental factor, or maybe an underlying disease, which we haven't picked up, which has made those birds on that one island susceptible. And that's one of the things that's about aspergillosis. Aspergillus is everywhere. It's probably one of the most common organisms on Earth. We have almost certainly got it in our lungs at the moment, but our immune systems cope with it. But it's when you get immunosuppressed that it can cause problems, especially if there's high loads of it. There's lots of the spores in the air.
So I'm guessing, just as a matter of caution, there's no thought of translocating birds from Codfish Island to anywhere else to increase the genetic diversity because of the potential risk of spreading a respiratory disease.
It's a good. We actually have done that. We've moved birds from Whenua to Anchor Island. The fungus was actually present on Anchor too, so we're not so concerned about presenting that fungus because it is actually there anyway. But we are actually concerned about the other disease, Clostridius crusty bum. And if a bird has had that, and then we do not move them to other sites because we still don't know the cause of it, and it could be some infectious agent behind it.
Well, because I'm not a real scientist, I'm going to use the term crusty bum. I love
that. It's more descriptive, eh?
Yeah. When did that start to be an issue, and what are the symptoms for the birds?
It started to be an issue in about 2002. That was when we first picked up the first case, and it kind of rumbled on for a little bit, just low levels of cases, and we go a few years when we didn't have any. And then actually in 2016, we had a real outbreak of cases. We stepped up all our surveillance. It went away again. We had hardly any cases in 2017 to 2019. And then actually this year, in the last few months, we've had a bunch more cases. So it seems like there's some sort of temporal factor here. It only crops up at certain conditions. We've done a lot of work to try and understand what that is, but we still haven't actually found the cause of it. But there's still quite a lot of research ongoing. And the symptoms are, it's inflammation of the cloaca of the bird, basically. So they kind of get these lesions, and it's obviously quite painful and uncomfortable for them. And they can get really big. The bird can basically get blocked up potentially and die as a result. But we can treat it if we get it early enough. Just with antibiotics, antifungals, we send them to hospital if they're really bad, and that seems to cure
it. How do you treat them? I mean, are you able to do something like dose the water or dose a food source rather than having to continually catch the bird and apply ointment or injection or whatever?
Yeah.
What are the steps?
So they do go to a vet hospital. So they are in captivity there. So they are treated topically, and that's how it's done with the antifungals, and also we use antibiotics as well. So yeah, they go on a pretty intensive course of medication and it does seem to settle things down. We only tend to do that if they're really bad. We try and treat them in situ if we can, because we don't want birds to go off the island and in hospital. It's a really invasive thing. It's pretty stressful for them, and but yeah, the alternative is that the birds will die if not. So,
and is it a condition that recurs?
Well, that's a good question. We actually used to think so, but now we think it doesn't. We think a bird has it once and then doesn't have it anymore. It's kind of hard to tell. Sometimes we thought birds would pick it up again, but actually it might just be a sort of lasting damage to the cloaca, which makes it look pretty messy and yucky, and we thought that was the disease. But yeah, we're thinking now that just have it once.
Well, that sort of makes the treatment options a bit more clear, doesn't it? If that they do recover and it doesn't recur, then the idea of catching and treating and all of that extra stress seems like it is probably worthwhile.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and yeah, if it's a once-off, I guess the issues with it are that we don't want to be catching the birds very often, and with this disease, we have to monitor them more often to pick it up. In fact, we are doing a lot more remote monitoring, and this year we've actually, over the last probably 6-8 months or so, we've actually picked up 3 cases just remotely. So we have activity trackers on Kakapo. We've picked up that Kakapo. Some of these birds have got low activity. We've gone to investigate, and then we've found they've had this condition. So that's a really important aspect of our work, is being more hands-off. And so that remote monitoring methods, really help, so we don't have to stress the birds out by catching them too often.
I did an interview quite a long time ago now with Scott Mowat, who made the excellent film that I recommend everyone has a look at on YouTube, The Unnatural History of the Kakapo. And I didn't release it for quite a while, but since I have, it's been probably the most popular in terms of the time from release and the number of people who have checked it out. But a question that has kept coming up is, how many kakapo are there in each of your distinct populations, and how dire is the genetic diversity issue now? Because the end of Scott's film was that they've had the most successful breeding season ever, and everything is looking good, but the situation rapidly declined again. What led to the decline, and I guess what I'm getting to is, how crucial is it to move the individuals from each of the separate populations to either to rotate the diversity or to increase the diversity?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we don't really know the answers to that. We know what we think we should do, and that's what we're doing at the moment. Is we do move birds around a reasonable amount. So we've done a lot of genetic work. We have the genomes of every kakapo, and we haven't done the 2019 cohort yet, but we're going to do those. So we actually have as much genetic information as it's possible to get. And we've done a lot of work, and we're working with a lot of geneticists to do more. But we do move birds around to make sure that there's the best possible mix of genetics on each island, and to also make sure that you don't have situations where mothers are mating with sons, that sort of thing. Really close relatives are likely to mate. So we do that mixing as much as we can. In terms of numbers, we've got a bit of a mix. So we've got 2 main breeding islands, Benuaho and Anchor Island. They've roughly at the moment got around about 65 birds on them. They got up to about 100 actually after the last breeding season. They got too full. We've moved birds off. We also have birds on, we've got to start at a new breeding island called Takakahu, or Chalky Island, which is right down the south of Fiordland. That's a small population of about 26 birds at the moment. We've got some birds on Hoturu, Little Barrier Island, which is right in the north near Auckland. We've got 13 birds up there. That's a bit of a trial site, but that's a breeding site too. And then we've got a bachelor pad. We've got an island, Pearl Island, off Rakira or Stewart Island, which has just got males on it.
And so that's like a nursery island. Now let's talk about one of the problems that was highlighted in Scott's film was that I think it was Sinbad you had, who was a young male, was rocking and ready to go, but his dad was the dominant male in the area. So Sinbad wasn't breeding with available females because, was it Bob? Bob was his dad.
Richard Henry is Sinbad's dad.
Sorry,
yep.
Richard, who was dominating the area, and I think, because it's a while since I watched the film, but it seemed like he had lower fertility, so he was dominating the area because kakapos display and boom, and so they're basically parrots who think they're lyrebirds, that kind of thing, and the other males sort of don't get a look in that the adjoining territories, not just that territory. So is that a problem in your breeding areas where you have low virility males who are just behaviourally dominating the scene?
Yeah, that definitely can be a problem. We've had quite a few males who have been booming for years, probably decades, and have never produced any offspring. So they're the ones that we kind of worry about, especially as some of those really old birds, which are likely to die soon. We do have a problem with some birds dominating and producing too many offspring. That's a real issue. We had one bird called Blades. He has produced about 22 offspring so far. He was so successful. He would set up his bowl. There'd be other males around him, but all the females would just go straight to him and ignore all the others. We actually moved him off of the main breeding island of Whenua and sent him up to Hotaru because he was just being too successful. He had more than enough of his offspring in the population. So that's a bit of an issue, but it's a bit of a balancing act because we want a good competition on the lek. So Kakapo, the only lek breeding parrot, they have this display sort of system. But we want to make sure that there's enough males to attract the females up there and that we get enough female interest. So we don't want too few males, but on the other hand, we don't want too many. An issue that we have is fighting. So we get males in the breeding season that will often kill each other, will often lose sort of one or two males every breeding season because of the fighting at the lek. So, yeah, we don't want too high density.
So in the roughly 10 years, I think, since that film was made, how much more understanding do you have about the behaviours of the parrot over both breeding and non-breeding season?
Yeah, it's a gradual process. You kind of would think with Kakapo, they're so intensively managed that we know everything, but we don't. We're still learning stuff all of the time, especially from a medical point of view, certainly, but also from behavioural. For example, we used to think that they were solitary birds. They used to think they'd always hang out on their own, but we know that's not true now. I've found a couple of birds on the same branch of the same tree, completely unrelated to each other, just hanging out. We've had people seeing 5 Kakapo in a tree before. So they do have definitely some social structure. We didn't know that at all. And we're finding things out about them sort of from a morphological point of view when we're doing all these scans and things that we didn't know about. So yeah, it's a definite learning curve.
Well, I guess the social aspect shouldn't really come as any surprise because parrots are generally like that, aren't they?
Yeah, that's true. Kakapo tend not to follow the rules, but yeah, they're not super social, but they definitely have some social structure. They do come together, and we didn't know that because they're nocturnal. They're cryptic. They're really hard to follow. But we've got better technology now. We've got GPS trackers on them and that sort of thing, so we can find out a bit more about those behavioural aspects.
How many of the birds that are on the intensively managed sites are tracked?
So every Kakapo's got a transmitter on it. So they all are tracked, every single one that we know of. There's a slight exception that sometimes some of the transmitters fail. So we'll always have a small number of birds we don't have gone off the radar. But yeah, so these trackers don't give us their location, but they do give us their activity. And that's one of the things that we've been really working on over the last few years is that we have these transmitters that record their activity. So basically every Kakapo's got a Fitbit pretty much. And we now have a data network across the islands, which is a bit of like a Wi-Fi network, which picks up the data from those activity trackers, transmits it to the internet. So wherever we are, we can kind of tell what's going on. So we can tell obviously if a bird is dead, but we can also tell if a bird's getting sick, not moving much. We can tell if it's mated, who it's mated with, how long it's mated for, a quality score of the mating. We can tell if it's nesting, that sort of thing. So that's the kind of the hands-off remote monitoring that we're trying to do more and more of.
Now, the islands are all offshore, obviously, because they're islands, but some of them are quite remote and difficult to visit. So how frequently are members of the team actually on the ground doing checkups?
Yeah, a lot of the time, most of the time. So we do have people on the islands. We don't tend to check every bird all of the time, and we will normally catch a bird once a year to change its transmitter. That's the kind of baseline. But we'll monitor those birds monthly. We'll check signals for them at least once a month to tell whether they're alive or not. Some of the islands we don't have those data networks. We use a plane or fly over in a plane to get signals. But yeah, more often than not, we'll have people on the ground checking on them as well, and just ready on hand to step in if need be.
So you just get the light plane. You've got the Cessna or something circling the island a couple of times to pick up the data, or do you have to do a grid pattern over each island to secure the information?
We do a grid pattern, so it flies a grid and it gets the basic. It doesn't get the full activity, and we get that from the data networks, but we don't get that from the plane. But it does give us the live dead, and it gives us whether they're mated, that sort of thing. So that's quite a handy tool to have.
And so the data network, have you got like a central hub near the place that the boat pulls up and somebody gets off, like a spy movie, runs up, plugs in, downloads everything, and then gets off? Yeah.
That all actually just goes via the internet. So yeah, we don't actually need to go there. So they've got that central hub, sends it via the internet, either with the satellite, or some places we're able to use just cell. So yeah, we got all that information remotely, which is really handy, and it's kind of a real change, a gradual change of direction for us, because Kakapo are kind of famously intensively managed. I couldn't believe when I joined the team just how intensive the management is, but that works. That's necessary if you've got 100 birds or 80 or something. But as you get more, when over 200, we have to step back, and that's a key part of the process. We don't want to be that intensive. We want Kakapo just to be running around without these backpacks on, doing their own thing. So that's the journey that we're on, is just stepping back. And every year we step back a little bit more, especially in the breeding season. In this upcoming breeding season, we're going to take some reasonably big steps to become less intensive. It's kind of a little bit scary for us. We are going to probably lose more Kakapo as a result, but that's what we have to do. We cannot manage this intensively forever. We need to get to a point where we can just let them do their own thing. And bearing in mind, there's still only 204. They're still critically endangered, so we have to be very careful, but we have to start making those steps. And that's where the technology is really, really key.
Now, the numbers got down to about 30, didn't they?
About 51 is the best estimate. In the mid-90s is the lowest that they got down to. Yeah.
Okay. And for such long-lived, they're very long-lived birds, as you mentioned earlier. I mean, I think 20, 25 is about middle age, I think, and they can get to sort of the thinking maybe an average old age would be in the 40s, but some birds could be many, many times longer than that.
Yeah, it's probably a bit higher than that. So we actually don't have a reliable way of aging them. We've never tracked enough Kakapo from any Kakapo from birth to natural death. But what we can do is we use their transmitter information to basically look at how many long we had transmitters on birds and how many have died. And if you do those sums, it kind of works out about 60 is the mean life expectancy. I think that's an underestimate, and that's obviously just the mean. And so you will get some birds which will go up to probably easily 90, maybe 100, maybe more.
So if we said about 60, if we agreed on that number, what is the breeding age, do you think, of both males and females?
Yeah, so we know now females can start just around about 5 years old, just a little bit under. We've had a 4.5 as the youngest female. Males will try early, but they're not normally successful. In fact, until last breeding season, we hadn't had any males under 11 who had actually fathered chicks. Now we've had some 8-year-olds, but they'll definitely try. But yeah, they tend to not obviously have the technique or whatever it is to be successful until a bit older. And then in terms of the other end, that they'll keep going. We've got one bird who's an adult. She was found 40 years ago. She's still breeding. In fact, she had a clutch of eggs in 1981, and the next time she had offspring was in 2016, a gap of 35 years. So they will keep breeding. And we've had one or two birds which we think are older who have kind of slowed down a bit. But yeah, we haven't really hit the upper limit.
Now, one of the techniques that a lot of programs use to sort of guarantee breeding success or to secure breeding success is removal of eggs, some of the eggs, and incubating in an incubator, and then returning the chicks or fostering the chicks. Do you use that technique?
Yeah, we do. So typically we remove all of the eggs. That's what we've done in the past. We remove all the eggs and replace them with dummy eggs because we've tended to be a bit more successful at incubating them than the kakapo have. And then we'll hatch the chicks in the incubator, and once they're about 1 or 2 days old, we'll put them back in the nest as much as we can. There's normally too many chicks to go round. The mothers can't support that many. So we always end up hand rearing some too. Having said that, we are probably switching to a bit more of having more chicks hatching naturally in nests. We're going to try that a little bit more as well. But yeah, typically we incubate quite a lot of them.
So I guess that there's that sort of conflict that the mothers need to be carrying out the behaviours to learn or to reinforce them, and to carry them on and to pass them on. How important do you think that natural rearing might be? Like I guess to phrase it a different way, how successful are good mothers in the kakapo world generally? How many chicks can they raise from each brood?
They're pretty amazing at what they do. We typically only have about 1 chick per nest. They'll lay up to 5 eggs. They'll lay often 3 eggs, but up to 5. And normally only be able to raise 1, and that's a food supply issue. But in years when there's lots of food, like in 2019 when we had a really big Remo mouse, that's the tree fruit that they breed in response to, we had quite a few mothers with 3 chicks in their nests, and we hadn't tried that before. And some of those were first-time mothers as well, never raised chicks before, and they successfully raised 3 chicks. And by the time the chicks get quite big, the mother's quite small. She has a really, really hard time feeding them. So I remember going to one nest, and there was over 4.5 kilos of chicks in there, and the mother only weighed 1 kilo. So she's got a real hard job trying to feed those and feed herself as well. So yeah, they're pretty incredible. They're very resilient and really tolerant too. So we do a lot of chick fostering as well. We move chicks between nests a lot to try and maximize the survival, and they completely accept someone else's chick, another bird's chick or another bird's egg, and yeah, I'm sure they know that it's not their chick. They've got an incredible sense of smell. They must know, but yeah, they'll accept it, and you can reach into a kakapo nest and take a chick out from under a female kakapo and not get too much of a nip, and then put another one back in, and she'll brood it. So that's really, really helpful for us.
And males have no involvement in rearing the chicks?
No, they mate, and that's it. That's all they do. Yeah. So the mother has to do all of it. So that's and she'll leave those chicks for a long time at night. So naturally, well, certainly when there was mammals in New Zealand, that would be one of the main reasons why they just crashed, because there would have been stoats and cats and weasels and ferrets and things just raiding those nests.
Well, that leads up to something we'll talk about soon. But let's talk about more interesting kakapo facts. The Remo berry, is that like the mirror bush? Is that similar?
Like the Miro tree, you mean?
No. I think what do we call it here? New Zealand mirror bush. It's a caprosma. It's got the shiny green leaves and berries. It's a massive pest in some parts. Yeah.
Yeah. No. So the Remu is a conifer tree. It's a massive tree.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a southern conifer. You don't get it all throughout New Zealand, but you get more of it in the south. And so on our southern islands, that's the main thing that they breed in response to. And it doesn't fruit every year, or it doesn't fruit a lot, but it has these mass fruiting events which happen about every 2 to 4 years or so.
Okay. And are those trees suffering a decline, or are they bouncing back as more areas get special protection?
Right. Yeah, there's actually plenty of them in some places. So the trees are not an issue. So, for example, I know of a lot of places in New Zealand, especially on the South Island, where there's lots and lots of Remo, the amazing kakapo habitat, but it's just full of cats or stoats. So that's the reason we can't put them there. So there's definitely the habitat for kakapo in terms of the trees, but not because of the pests.
Okay, well that's probably a good time to talk about the Predator Free New Zealand initiative, which I watch with interest, all the updates that I see about that. Now, as an Australian, I'm amazed that anyone thought it was a good idea to put stoats and weasels and minks and whatnot out into the wild. How hard is it to clear those pests out, and let's include cats and have you ever had foxes there? You had foxes too?
No,
Didn't you?
they were.
No.
I think they tried to introduce them, but it never succeeded. Yep. So they've
Oh,
never established.
they're lucky
Yeah, we
there.
dodged that one.
Yeah. So how hard is it to clear a hectare of those mammal pests?
Incredibly hard, basically. So there's mice, stoats, rats for starters. Stoats are very, very difficult. And we see that in a lot of the work that we do. So for example, with takahe, so the other species that I'm involved in, the rail, they live in areas where there are stoats. There's a lot of stoat trapping goes on. But we are seeing more and more evidence of trap shy stoats, these stoats that just learn not to go into traps. And they cover huge ranges. They're pretty devastating in their impact on the birds. And every now and again, when we get these mass events, this mass fooding of the trees, we get a huge explosion of rats and mice that feeds the stoats, and then you get a big stoat explosion. So yeah, it's incredibly difficult. The whole Predator Free 2050 goal is almost unbelievably ambitious, but it's kind of cool actually what's happening. It's been really quite encouraging to see what it started. It's not just about the end goal, it's about getting at least some of the way there, and some of the way there in some regions too. So yeah, for example, Wellington, the capital of New Zealand, is working to become pest free. There's whole suburbs of Wellington which have no rats. They were overrun with rats, and now they don't have any. So that's kind of cool. It's sparked off a real grassroots movement, I think, to do a lot of local trapping, a lot of predator control. And it's just raised a lot of awareness about what things are like, what they used to be, and how to get back there.
New Zealand's a really interesting sort of social case because you have the Maori still maintaining traditional ways, but also being urbanised. There's no really easy way to talk about it without sounding paternalistic or whatever. But Maori are still continuing their traditional connection with the land, as well as not. And we have the dominant European culture superimposed on top. Now, I'm thinking, looking from afar, that the Maori are always going to be very, very concerned about preserving New Zealand wildlife. How important is it now in the mainstream consciousness of broader New Zealand society? Does it rank in the top 3 issues when you go into an election?
I don't know if it's that high. I'd kind of like to think it is. I guess the caveat here is that I'm in a little bubble. I live in a conservation world bubble, so it's kind of it's obviously important to a lot of the people I speak to. But on the whole, I think it's it's not that high. But it is very high compared to a lot of other countries. I think conservation, the native wildlife is is really critical to a lot of New Zealanders. So it may not be top 3, but I'd like to think it's top 5. And so and it's becoming more so. I think more and more people are sort of realizing the value of it, realizing what's lost. And examples like Wellington, where there's a wildlife sanctuary, which was a pest-free wildlife sanctuary, and it's spilled out. There's basically so much wildlife in the city, which was previously extinct, and now everyone's got all these birds in their gardens which haven't been there for 150 years. It's pretty amazing to see, and that's the kind of thing which people are suddenly realizing, wow, this is what it could be like, and people are getting behind that.
I mean, that's the great thing about preserving an icon species, that the efforts that go into the icon species, and I mean, I've with Scott obviously talked about Kakapo and Takahe, but everything else benefits at the same time, which, as you've just mentioned, then that drives more awareness. So are there moves afoot to really intensively work, for want of a better term, some of this Remu habitat on the mainland to be able to put Kakapo in other places on the mainland, or is that just too risky with the numbers of birds that remain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our ultimate goal is we want to put Kakapo back on the mainland. We want them everywhere in New Zealand where they used to be, which is pretty much the whole country. And as I said before, there's the places, the habitat for them to do that. It's just a pest issue. So we're getting there. I guess our first step is, in fact, maybe as soon as next year, we're looking at putting Kakapo back on the mainland, but in a fenced sanctuary. So that's the kind of baby steps that we will take to try and understand just how they go. And, there's some of these places where they will be at risk of stoat predation, for example, with looking at some sites on the mainland, and even on the offshore islands, which have low numbers of stoats. So that's kind of a bit of the first step, because predator-free 2050 would be an amazing goal. But, if we don't get there, we might not have no stoats, but we might have low numbers in some big areas. And Kakapo would be able to cope with that. We would lose some individuals, but as a population, they could still probably do okay. So that's the kind of thing we're looking at the moment. It's too early just to release them in some forests in Fiordland, for example, where there are a lot of stoats. But there's a lot of work going on with the predator-free area, especially with the pest control over huge areas. And so they're the sort of sites that we will look to put Kakapo back in once the stoat numbers get low enough.
Is there an individual minister who's spearheading predator-free 2050?
There's a minister for conservation, so they're kind of the main minister who will be behind that. There's an organisation, Predator-Free 2050, who are basically coordinating a lot of it, and that's where it's really key, I think, because you can't just impose this stuff from the top. It needs to come up from the bottom, and it's a collection of grassroots organisations which are now being given the resources that they need and banding together to try and do this, at least on the local scale. Of course, there's still bigger issues on a much broader scale. You've got huge areas of Fiordland in the South Island, which there aren't any local community groups, for example. To try and do pest control in those sort of areas is going to require a massive coordinated effort, probably from organisations like DOC. But and it's just working on the technologies of how do you do that. New Zealand's got pretty good at eradicating pests from large areas, from islands, and it's then just applying those methods and developing them a little bit more to be able to do that on the mainland.
And of course, it needs money, and of course, governments have never got enough money. So, is there have there been any corporate white knights who have decided this is a good way to contribute to the community, who are really on board and significantly contributing?
There's a lot of individual donors. There's a lot of individuals, wealthy individuals, who are definitely getting in behind it. There's a growing sort of awareness of corporate responsibility and corporate donations, and we see that in the Kakapo program. We have corporate partnerships who donate a significant amount of money to our work. Air New Zealand, for example, does quite a lot. So that's definitely growing, I think, as more and more, everyday people get involved. The corporates see that actually, we need to be on this as well. So, yeah, I think that's in a pretty good state in New Zealand. I can't really compare to other countries, but yeah, it's going pretty well. It's definitely improving.
Who are your big supermarkets and retail groups in New Zealand?
So they're all Australian, I think, like foodstuffs and yeah,
Well,
progressive. So
and have you got Bunnings? Have they invaded over there?
yeah, they have. Yep.
Okay. So, geez, Bunnings, wouldn't
Yeah,
that be a good thing to get involved with? To
yeah.
be the major stakeholder in predator free New Zealand 2050, and imagine all the stuff they could sell to help.
Well, we did actually have a tie up with Take with a hardware chain called Mitre 10, who they provided us with financial support, and they provided us with a lot of materials, like fence materials, that sort of thing.
Yeah, fencing. Really cool. That's what I was thinking straight away.
Yeah, and there's now a partner called Fulton Hogan who are kind of like, they do a lot of infrastructure stuff, roading and that. So actually, we are seeing quite a lot of crossover, and with Kakapo, we've got energy company Meridian, and they actually contribute a lot of expertise on our power systems on our islands, for example, which is kind of cool. So it's actually quite nice when you get those corporates who can, donate their expertise. It's not just financial support, and we really need that expertise. And so, yeah, that's quite cool. I think there's always more scope to do a lot more, but yeah, some of the stuff that we do is quite cool like that.
Now you ran. Is it still going? Adopt a Kakapo?
Yeah, that's still going. So you can adopt a Kakapo, and it's actually temporarily on pause while we just revamp it, but it should start again later this month. And yeah, we have donations and that on our website, and that's actually a really key part of what we do as well. We get a lot of interest from around the world. I'm always amazed by how many people are interested in Kakapo in countries and places where they'll never get to see one in real life, but they still love them and contribute and adopt them and donate and stuff. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
Well, there's no doubt that shagging Stephen Fry's head was a very important moment.
Yeah, that made a big difference. Yeah, that was a turning point.
Have you still got plushies as part of the Adopt a Kakapo?
If you adopt a Kakapo, you get a little plushie. Yeah.
Have you sort of modelled that program for other species? Like what? Well, let's move across to the Takahe, because of course Scott and I talked a bit about the Takahe as well, and the fact that they're existing quite well in fenced off reserves that you have managed to make pest free or predator free. How are they doing now?
They're actually doing really well. So I guess one of the differences with Take is that we can farm them. We can't farm Kakapo. We can't force them, in a pen with a pair to breed, sort of thing. But we can do that with Take. We keep them in quite big natural enclosures, but they live there pretty well and breed. And so that's a real engine room. So we're producing a lot of Take a year. The issue with Take, and it's a growing issue with Kakapo too, and a lot of New Zealand species, that we're running out of room, places to put them. So there's been quite a lot of Take on sanctuary sites, so on offshore islands, kind of exotic habitat, not really the natural habitat that they came from. But we're looking at more and more to having Take in big wild sites. And actually, Scott's new film called A Brave New Wilderness tells that story really well. And that sort of tells that story of helping to set up one of these new wild sites of Take. So yeah, Take are growing. The population is growing well. There's over about 450 of them now. They have recently, in the last, it was 2017, got down listed. So they were at the highest threat level. They've now gone down a couple of notches to nationally vulnerable rather than nationally critical. So they're going in the right direction, but we've got this big habitat issue. Where do we put them all? And we need new places. And that's where the predator-free 2050 or those predator control efforts come in.
So that raises the big question that it's not a question, it's a big issue, and it's the conundrum that I always have. If it was important enough for the governments of the world to put money into making sure that a critically endangered species is no longer critically endangered, surely it follows that it's important enough to rehabilitate enough habitat for the numbers that you have saved and increased to have somewhere to go. It just seems insane logically that you would run out of habitat because it hasn't been prepared for the expansion. It's almost like they go, well, we'll throw the money at it. we'll say we're trying to save it, but it won't work. So we don't need to do anything in 10 years' time. And that seems to be a feedback loop, of insanity that we see happening all the time. And I struggle with the idea of what's the point in having 1,000 birds in captivity? What's the point? If there's nowhere for them to go, why don't we just sell them for $350,000 or $1 million each to rich collectors around the world and maintain captive populations? I just struggle with that whole thing that we'll save them and keep them in cages.
And that's a really good point. And I think we need to get better at connecting that species recovery with the whole predator control stuff. And I think that's happening, but almost in a way, I think the Takahe and Kakapo are probably the populations have expanded quicker than what was expected, especially for Kakapo. We had these, the population increased by 70% over the last 5 years. We had these two massive breeding events, they were pretty much 1 in 50 year mast events. So that was, that's crept up on us a bit quicker. The Takahe, the population's growing at 10% a year. That breeding is working really well. And I think that one of the main issues is that pest control, that habitat, large scale habitat restoration stuff, that's really hard. That's much harder, I think, than protecting these birds and breeding these birds. But that's where the nub is.
But that raises the issue, doesn't it? That the resources need to be made available. And I have this vision of someone deep in the bowels of the Treasury building going, "Damn you, Andrew Digby! Damn you! We haven't budgeted this until 2025 or 2035." And that's where I get frustrated, that there doesn't seem to be a reverse funnel, that the money doesn't go into an endangered species program, and then once you get successful, you only need to drip feed into it. No. It needs to be the other way out. You have the small amount of money going in, you become successful, and then a flood of money is needed to repair, protect, rehabilitate habitat.
That's a good point. I mean, I guess to be fair, the Predator Free 2050 thing is trying to fix that. So it is trying to make huge areas of habitat available for species like Kakapo and Takahe. So I guess that's the start of that journey to try and achieve that. We do have places that we can put them. You can put Kakapo in large fenced sanctuaries. You can do the same for Takahe, but we need it on a much, much bigger scale. So that's where that's trying to go. And I think New Zealand's a little bit unusual in a lot of countries in that it's got a relatively large amount of its natural ecosystems intact.
Still intact,
at least from a tree, a vegetation point of view. So there are places.
You certainly have the framework. You have the framework there, and I'm not sure that you've had the mass extinction of your plant life that many other ecosystems have suffered. So if you leave it alone, it comes back.
Yeah, if we could get rid of the rats and the stoats out of it and the cats, then it's perfect. We put them there tomorrow. There's places like Rakura, Stewart Island, just near where I am now. That's a massive island. It's perfect habitat for Kakapo in a lot of places, and that's where one of the remnant populations were found. That's where the last females survived. We would put them back there tomorrow if there was no cats on that island. There's no stoats on that island. There's only cats and rats and possums. And there's now a movement underway, and it's all started basically to try and look at eradicating the island, the animals from the island. It's got people living on it, which makes things really complicated. But if that's technically feasible, if that can go ahead, then that's the sort of thing that's needed to solve this problem. And if we had Rakura for Kakapo, that's a massive, massive step towards saving the species for the long term.
How do you eradicate cats?
That's really hard. And I actually think you guys are probably better at it than we are at the moment, but there's actually quite a lot of work going into that. And there's a team who are working on the Auckland Islands who've been looking at the feasibility of doing it on the Auckland Islands. And that work has stopped, but they've just published their feasibility study, which they've got a method which they think will work. So yeah, that's one of the hard ones. Cats are really hard. I'm not an expert by any means, but I know it's difficult.
Do you know what method they've recommended to use?
There's a new toxin which is just about out. It's registered for use in some bait stations. It's called PAP. So it's basically a toxin which inhibits the uptake of, you might know it. In fact, it's probably been used quite a bit in Australia, I think.
I'm not sure if it's the same name, but it's probably the same substance, the same, or at least very close. We did an episode with Richard Sinclair, who was studying predators in the Grampians here, and I think that was one of the things being explored. I think the benefit, I think, is that it's not so harmful for any animals that scavenge, any native animals that scavenge on the carcasses.
Yep. Yeah, it only targets carnivores as well, which is a big sort of thing for New Zealand as well. So yeah, that's a key point, and it's less harmful to birds as well than other toxins, and it's much more humane as well. So I think that's the kind of tools. But yeah, as I said, I'm not an expert in that field by any means.
I'll have to link to that study. If is it publicly available, their feasibility proposal?
I think it might be. I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have
Sorry,
to.
I can confirm that.
We'll have to link up on that and see if I can link to it. I'm sure people will be really interested, because a lot of people look to New Zealand for the successes that you continually have on all of the islands. I mean, it's really encouraging in a global sense to see real key habitats being returned to the original occupiers, and to see the populations flourish. Let's talk about some of the other parrots. I know that you're not an expert with any of them, but I'm always curious, having been sent some bird books when I was a kid about the kea and the kaka. How are they doing?
Generally, they're not doing very well. So their populations are declining. I don't know the full details about their population trends. The big issue with kea is just even knowing how many there are. So they're the alpine parrot. They live in, they fly huge distances. They live in places where it's pretty hard to survey them. So just even knowing whether there's any, between 1,000 of them or 5,000 of them in the country, it's kind of hard to tell. But their populations in general are not declining. And the same with kaka as well. A lot of those issues come back to that predator thing as well. So stoats are a real issue for both of those species. They're hole nesters, and they'll nest in a hole in a tree or under a rock or something, and the stoat will get in and then often take the chicks and the breeding female. So yeah, that's probably the number one problem for those species.
And how about your little green parrots, the ones that I knew as kakariki, but I think they've all been renamed now
yeah, so the kakariki, there's different subspecies of them, and there's the orange-fronted kakariki is the one that's in the most trouble. I don't work on this, but the numbers are really quite low, and they're being bred in captivity. If it wasn't for that captive breeding, they probably would just about be extinct or on the verge of extinction. So that's a real effort to try and understand how to translate that into viable wild populations. And again, that's back to the predators. Rats will be a big issue for kakariki, particularly. When we have mast years, when there's big rat explosions, the numbers of rats in the bush is just kind of almost unbelievable, the amount that you see running around even during the daytime. And so those small hole nesting birds of the forest just really don't stand a chance.
And what are the other the other really critical, or the other birds in New Zealand that have got real critical problems? Are there any of the little brown jobs, the ones that nobody notices, the ones that aren't iconic in behaviour or appearance, that really need some intervention quickly?
There's like shorebirds, so like the Tawahiti or the fairy tern. It's got real problems. So shore plover, fairy tern, kaki as well, the black stilt. So they're the ones that live in the braided rivers of the South Islands. They are all numbers and numbers are really low. So for those birds, it's a bit of a mix of habitat, unavailable habitat. A lot of the habitat is changing. For example, those braided rivers have got a lot of introduced weed species, which basically wipes out those gravelly, stony nesting areas that they have, but also pests as well. Rats and stoats and ferrets and cats, especially for a lot of those species, and hedgehogs too, are a real issue as well. So yeah, there's some of them.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that the hedgehog was a problem, but that someone needs to extend the possum pie industry to maybe possum and hedgehog pie.
Yeah, hedgehogs are a growing problem, and it's becoming more and more apparent just how much damage they do. And so that raiding birds' nests, but also for the invertebrates and for the lizard species as well. And yeah, there's more and more work and sort of more evidence is coming out of just what damage hedgehogs are doing, and they get to really high numbers in some areas in New Zealand. So, yep, hedgehog control is an issue.
Were hedgehogs somebody didn't want their pet hedgehogs anymore and let them go, or were they deliberately introduced?
I think they were deliberately introduced to acclimatization societies, wanting to make things a bit more like Europe. Yep. And ironic, I think there's probably more hedgehogs in New Zealand now than there are in England, for example, and the UK. And, they're massively declining over there. Numbers have declined by more than 50%, I think. But here they're going the other way.
So surely there could be a tie-up that the hedgehog preservation people in England could raise some funds and collect collect 20,000 of them from New Zealand and take care of their issues in one fell swoop.
Maybe a bit like the possums.
Yeah. Well, I'm really sorry about that, and I'm really sorry about the rainbow lorikeet too.
Yeah. Okay. Don't take it personally, but yeah.
Well, because that was where I wanted to go next, Andrew, was the invasive species for birds. What are the big problems that you see generally around New Zealand, especially around the urban areas, the urban fringes? What are the birds that give you the most trouble?
So it is things like, again, I'm not an expert on this, but things like the lorikeets and the miners are an issue. We're down here, I'm right down in the far south of New Zealand. It's actually pretty insulated from that. They're mostly up at the upper North Island where they've been, become established and they're gradually spreading their way south. But there's always the disease issue as well. And that's the one thing that you really worry about with some of those other parrot species. We see that from a kakapo point of view. So beak and feather disease for parrots it's something we haven't seen in kakapo, but it's something we monitor for, especially in those northern sites. And in fact, we have kind of rules, basically, if we send kakapo up to Hauturu, Little Barrier Island, where there is beak and feather, we don't then send them back again down south. That's a one-way ticket for those guys, unless we have some really long quarantine periods. So yeah, disease is a growing issue.
Did you have a look at all my previous episodes before we started talking? Because, of course, we did cover parrot beak and feather disease with Johanna Martins a little while ago.
Listened to that one. I should.
And update: Johanna's finished her work. So it's interesting on that. I had been seeing some of my local cockatoos suffering. But I guess since I did the interview with Johanna, which would be probably a year ago, haven't seen one. So hopefully that means it's not more prevalent. I mean, obviously, scientific, fantastically significant number of one from one survey site from one individual. But fingers crossed. How about things like blackbirds and have you got all of those kind of things that we got
we do.
bought over here? The song thrush.
There's lots and lots of those. They're not so much a problem for a lot of the New Zealand birds are forest birds. They're not really such a problem for those because they don't really establish in large numbers in the forest. They will obviously have some competition effects with birds which are more open areas, but there's actually relatively few of those left in New Zealand now, and it's mainly just focusing on those forest birds from a bird point of view. Plus, the shorebirds and the penguins, that sort of thing as well. But yeah, things like blackbirds and that are not really that much of an issue, I think. Yeah, again, not an expert, but
so we know the really big issue is the predator issue in New Zealand. But what are perhaps, if we talk about the kakapo and the takahe, what are let's say the three most important actions that you'll need to be carrying out with each of the teams? Say, let's keep it to a midterm thing, the next 5 years.
Yeah, okay. So for kakapo, it's infertility, disease, and habitat, finding more spaces. For takahe, it's probably habitat, and habitat. And
Right.
that's the key thing for takahe. There's some genetic concerns. The genetic concerns for takahe aren't as much. There's some disease concerns, but the number one for us for takahe is finding places to put them. And kakapo also had that problem, but kakapo have the added problems of disease and infertility.
Well, let's talk, just to wrap up the kakapo, because the genetic work is really critical. So how much diversity, how do I frame this to make sense? What population do you think you could get to with the genetics that you have available to you without causing problems?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's a difficult one to answer because we do have really low genetic diversity in kakapo. They're one of the lowest genetic diversities of any of the New Zealand bird species. And so from that point of view, it doesn't look that great. But then there's other parallels as well with other species. So I used to work with little spotted kiwi, for example. Little spotted kiwi got down to 5 individuals, probably 2 females, maybe only 1 female. They're now at over 2,000 individuals. And there are some genetic effects, but on the whole, they're still producing pretty well. So these genetic rules of, the 5,500 rule and those sort of things, it's kind of, I kind of think is a work in progress to understand exactly what's going on and what's possible. So I think we can get to thousands of kakapo from our current population easily based on other species. Unless there's massive disease issues, which we haven't foreseen. So I guess that's the key. That genetic diversity just gives you a better insurance against those sort of things. And kakapo don't have that insurance. They've got to kind of rely on quite a lot of luck and a lot of looking after to make sure they're not susceptible to those things.
I'm going to publicly demonstrate my outrageous lack of understanding of genetic work. Have you got from years gone by when it would have been a really cutting edge technology, do you have any semen stored from some of those earlier birds that you can then sort of Jurassic Park into existence? Is there value in samples that you have stored that you currently can't utilize that you think the technology in the future might allow you to utilize?
Yeah, it might do. So we have sperm samples from the early 2000s, so it's not that old. What we do have is a genetic data bank, basically, of all of the founders, so that all that we could get them from, 40 odd birds. And so we've got a frozen zoo, basically a frozen archive of that. We don't have any particular plans for that, but we've basically collected that genetic material in case it might be handy in one day. And there's a lot of talk about genetic engineering and cloning and all that sort of stuff. That sort of thing is a long way off for a species like kakapo. Birds for a start are really, really hard. But there's more importantly, I guess, it's just the social license of, do you want to even go there? And so that's not something we're talking about yet or thinking about, but we have the genetic material that maybe one day in future could be the difference between saving the species or not. And when you can save that, and we've got that we've got the choice between either not keeping that genetic material or keeping it, I'll definitely want to keep it just in case one day it could save the species.
So you do artificial insemination though, don't you?
We do. So the team has been trying that since 2002, I think, was the first time, or maybe 2005. And the team was successful in 2009. So that was the first time, I think, in any wild bird species that had been done successfully. And then for the next 3 breeding seasons, it didn't work at all, despite quite a lot of effort. And then in 2019, last breeding season, we were successful again. So that's something which it's just a learning process. It's really hard to do, but it could be really quite important to make sure we get that genetic representation carried on. So yeah, that's something we continue to work at.
And none of the founders. That sounds so much like a Netflix science fiction,
The founders,
doomsday scenario. The founders, the 40. None of their genetic material has been used to artificially inseminate any of the current or previous generation, have they?
Yeah, no, it has. They're the ones that we always target. So that's one of the reasons we do artificial insemination. And we have had some success from some of those. The other ones that we do is last breeding season, we had an offspring from Sinbad. Now, he's one of Richard Henry's offspring. So he's one of the Fiordland descendants. They've got really different genetics. So he has never made it successfully, but we successfully artificially inseminated the female and got a chick out of it. So yeah, that's another sort of genetic lineage which we're interested in. And that's why we still keep working at the artificial insemination.
So is Sinbad still going?
He's still going. Yeah, he's still pretty young. Yeah, so yeah, he's still going well. He's only he'll be 24 this next year. So yeah, he's still just an old teenager already.
But he can't get it right.
No, he's partially imprinted. He's partially imprinted on humans, but he did mate successfully with a female last breeding season, but they're infertile eggs. But we gave him a bit of a helping hand. But his brother, Gulliver, who's similar genetics, made it successfully. So yeah, he had offspring, which is cool. First time that happened.
Now that you've just raised another issue that we hadn't even touched on, but with all the handling of eggs and nestlings and the intensive monitoring, the feeding stations, how big a problem is imprinting? And I guess I'm thinking not only on the individual, but on the population in general. Do you think it's modifying the natural behaviours? They're becoming unnatural, and maybe that's having some effect on breeding success.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm actually doing a bit of work on this at the moment, looking into it. So that's something we're very aware of. So our default is we want to be as hands-off as possible and keep as many chicks in nests as we can. But, we intervene where it will save the lives. We have had birds which have been hand-reared. So that's a real key thing. Does that affect their ability to raise chicks? We've had hand-reared chicks have their own chicks. So that's we know that's not so much of an issue, but there might be some fertility concerns. And so that's something I'm looking at the moment. And we've got a lesson from Takahe here, because Takahe used to be hand-reared. And we've since found out that hand-reared Takahe only raise about 50% of the number of chicks as wild-reared ones. Their fertility is the same, their egg fertility is the same, but they just don't seem to be as good at the chick rearing part. And so that actually had quite an impact on the Takahe population, because suddenly you're halving your productivity. So that's something which is now stopped. And yeah, we haven't seen anything like that with Kakapo yet, but they're a long-lived bird. Things take a long time to manifest themselves, and so it might be later on in 30 years' time we suddenly realize, all that stuff that was going on had that impact on fertility or productivity in some way. So that's it's something we're really mindful of, and that's why we try and step back a little bit, and that's what we're doing again this breeding season. We're having one island where we reduce our intensive management by a lot. So we're really stepping back, and yeah, it's going to be slightly scary for us, but I think it's the way that we have to go.
Do you think there's any other critically endangered bird that is as intensively, and I would contend as well managed as Kakapo?
I don't know of any. I'd like to know, actually. I'd like someone to come along and sort of give me an example. But yeah, I mean, obviously there's some species in captivity which are monitored incredibly intensively, but in the wild, and especially in the kind of habitat that they're in, I don't know of any. But it is crazily intensive. But it's working. The population has been, since those intensive efforts began, the population's quadrupled, and for a slow breeding bird, that's kind of quite successful. But yeah, we need to step back from that, and that's what we're doing. We're actually embarking on a project now, sort of, we've just started a 5-year project to look at the future of Kakapo and how we actually get there. How do we step back? What tools do we need? What methods do we need? That sort of thing.
You get volunteers and I guess visiting academics from all over the world coming down both to assist you and to study what you're doing. Are you aware of many projects where your methods are being used on other species now?
Yeah, we do have some contact with other groups, and in particular, the technology is always quite a key one. So we often get quite a few inquiries from groups around the world wanting to say, how do you get these transmitters working, the smart feeders? I know that, for example, that some of the Hawaiian crow, the Alala program, are using some of our smart feeding stations, for example. So that's really cool. We're quite lucky with Kakapo that we do get a relatively, we don't get a lot of funding, but we get, a lot more than a lot of other programs. So it's cool to be able to give back and have those methods and those techniques and some of that technology to be able to, be passed on to other programs.
Andrew, every time you open your mouth and utter a sentence, there's another issue. How do the smart feeding stations work?
Oh yeah, so feeding, we basically, every Kakapo in a breeding season, we feed them in the breeding seasons to optimize their breeding conditions, make sure they're in good enough condition to breed. And we do that with a personalized feeding station. So every Kakapo gets its own feeding station. And the reason we personalize them is because we want to be able to control their weight, and especially the females, because we found that when the females got too heavy, they had too many male chicks. So we basically put them on a diet. We try and keep the females between 1.5 and 1.9 kilos. So they've got these feeders with a lockable lid, and the data logger which detects the transmitter. So when a bird comes to feed, the data logger picks up which bird it is, and then we can program it to only open for that particular individual. There's also a set of scales linked up to it too. So the bird will stand on the scales to feed, so it logs the weight, and we can get that weight information as well. So it basically enables us to control the weight of the birds. So that's how that works, and that's where the volunteers come in. Actually, the volunteers are kind of a key part of that feeding program. So yeah, so that's how that works, and we've been able to sort of correct the sex bias in the population by like that. So we now don't have too many male chicks. Now it's roughly about 50-50.
Now, please tell me that you have approached either Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig for some funding to not only brand the scales, but to buy them for you and to brand the feeding stations.
No, we haven't actually done that, but it's a good idea.
That seems to me to be a no-brainer. Jenny Craig or Weight Watchers, what are you doing? What are you doing? This is, I have never seen a more purpose-built campaign where you are maintaining females' weight to increase the desired breeding outcome. Hey, come on. There's got to be
having a lock on your fridge.
There's got to be someone in a boardroom who listens to this and says, "Oh yeah, we can afford 40K to brand all this equipment, because then it's going to be in all your YouTube videos, right?"
Yeah, it will be. Yeah. The males we don't.
They're worldwide brands, aren't they? I think certainly.
I think
certainly
so,
Weight Watchers is. So
yeah.
All right.
Yeah, nice idea.
Invoices in the mail, Andrew. So, all right. I want to talk about you now. We're going to wave goodbye to our parrot, the Kakapo, and the second half of the show. Although it's not going to be half, trust me, Andrew.
Yeah, there's not that much to talk about me.
We really got way into the weeds, which is good. Gives you the opportunity to really spread the word. How did you get interested in birds, Andrew?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I didn't grow up in New Zealand. I grew up in the UK, and I grew up in a place which has got quite a lot of birds in it. A place called East Anglia on the east coast of the UK, and I had family who were into that sort of thing, and their parents would take me to nature reserves and stuff as a kid. So that's kind of how I got into it, and birds around the garden and that sort of thing. So yeah, from an early age, I was was a bit of a nature nerd, definitely. But I didn't actually go that way from a career point of view. I ended up branching off because I also really liked astronomy. So I ended up becoming an astronomer, did a PhD in astronomy and became a research astronomer for a little while. So yeah, wandered on that career and then I've come back to the nature.
I think that's the best dogleg that I've come across so far. Astronomy
it's a bit of an unusual one.
Into conservation. So, what prompted the move to New Zealand? Was that a family move, or did you move to New Zealand for opportunity in academia?
Yeah, no, that was a family move. So that was my ex-partner. I was a New Zealander, so I came to New Zealand about 15 years ago. There's not a whole lot of astronomy in New Zealand, so I ended up making the switch then.
Okay, and I just want to go back to East Anglia for a minute. For those of us who aren't that familiar with the UK, what city would we be talking about for East Anglia?
A city called Norwich. Yeah.
Oh, Norwich. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's so Newcastle is further to the north.
Yeah, that's right up in the north. Yeah, and Norwich is kind of about 100 miles from London. There's a big bumpy outbit on the east coast of the UK, and that's where Norwich is.
Are they rocky beaches there or sandy beaches?
No, sandy beaches. Okay. Yeah, and it's kind of a little bit out of the way. It's a little bit sort of rural, agricultural area. People don't really go there unless you've got a reason to, sort of thing. So it's a bit quiet. It's a nice place. It's cool.
Yeah. So when you were watching birds as a kid, what were your favourites? Were the things like the tits or was it wagtails and pipits, or being coastal? Were you more into terns? Or
not really see. Well, there's some kind of the rarer birds. There's things like a bird called the avocet, a wading bird, which was just about extinct, and we used to see, which was pretty exciting. Bitterns as well. Bitterns were extinct where I lived, but they kind of came back during my childhood, and so as a kid, you remember seeing one for the first time. It was pretty amazing, and then go back now and you kind of see them reasonably regularly. So yeah, some of those. There's a lot of water there. It's a lot of marshland sort of stuff. So those wetland birds really.
So where's your favourite place that you've been birding anywhere in the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess some of these islands in New Zealand, these offshore islands, which have been, the predators been removed and the habitat's been restored, is pretty amazing. I'm not really a birder, but I really appreciate those, the diversity of the wildlife in those places. And I think that's what's really key, is to try and, we want to get as many people to those places as we can, because just to see what it could be like. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty noisy places. Whenua Codfish Island is, one of the main kakapo breeding islands, but it's also home to about 1 million seabirds breeding there as well. So on a night in the kakapo breeding season, you're in a tent up on the top of the island. You listen, there's a kakapo booming all around you. There's hundreds of thousands of seabirds all making a racket up above you. It's pretty incredible place to be able to spend some time. We're very lucky, and we just need more people to be able to see it.
Do you have a lot of crossover with in terms of the volunteers and researchers with seabirders helping you guys out because you're in the same location?
Yeah, we do. Yep. So there's been a couple of recent PhD students, for example, working on those islands, studying those seabird populations. And so, that's definitely part of it. And so we'll end up sharing accommodation, and they end up kind of kakapo experts too, help us out, and we help them out as well. So that works well.
Yeah, that's great. That's one of the great things about the whole bird community, is that people tend to share and not be overly precious with what they know, except maybe in the last 6 weeks before they publish. I don't know. Hey, are you still on that publications treadmill? Do you have to keep publishing?
I actually find it really hard. I'd kind of like to, and that's something actually I'm trying to work on at the moment, but things are so busy, it's really hard to find time to that. I've got a whole heap of things that we could do, and we work with a lot of people to kind of help other people publish a lot. But I'm trying to write a few papers at the moment. I've got a few on the go, but it takes a long time because work gets in the way. But I think it's quite important for our program as well to be able to publish stuff, just to be able to, that scientific credibility and getting some of that information out there, because some of it's not, and there's definite crossover to other species. So making sure that people can learn from the things that we've learned.
So you're not a massive birder, so I'm assuming you don't keep a list.
No, I don't. No, afraid not.
But do you have a favourite field guide?
Don't think I do, actually. No, sorry.
No,
sorry to disappoint, but no.
No, that's okay. I like someone who's not totally totally fixated. But the favourite bird question, I have to ask you that. Now, I'm going to assume it's a kakapo, or have you had kakapo overload? And is it your kiwi that's still your favourite?
I do like kiwi. Kiwi are pretty amazing birds. Yeah, so I'd kind of be keen to do some more work with kiwi at some point. I'm kakapo, kiwi are both up there. I kind of like some more normal birds as well. I'm actually a bit of a fan of a songthrush. I quite like songthrush as a common bird to have around your garden. They're pretty cool.
That's one of the birds that mythically lives in Melbourne, but I've never seen it. It's supposed to be here. Never seen it, but we have the blackbird everywhere. I mean, blackbirds just everywhere. But yeah, I think that's the introduced bird that I would kind of like to see. But,
there's actually a lot of them down where I live here. There's more here than when I was growing up in the UK, definitely. But yeah.
What are they displacing in New Zealand?
I actually don't know what they're displacing here. They're kind of like, they'll only live in those open areas, and which were naturally forested here. So yeah, without the forest there, I don't know if there's actually any native birds that they would be displacing. Yeah. Really
maybe pipits or something like that.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Bucket list. Is there a bird on your bucket list, or let's say your interests are a bit wider? Have you got an animal, if not a bird, on your bucket list
that I haven't seen? Well, I've never actually seen a platypus, and I'd love to see a platypus. That's kind of pretty common for you guys, but I've tried a few times, but I've never seen one. So yeah, I was pretty excited to see a cassowary when I was up in Queensland. That was pretty cool. But so they were on my list and saw those.
Yeah, platypus are pretty amazing. They seem to have made a bit of a comeback, but I think recently that might have been wound back. I've been lucky enough to see them just splashing on the surface, but you don't get much of a look at them out in the wild. But it was just really exciting to know that they were in that particular stream. But they don't seem to have been or to be doing so well now. And location, Andrew, it's the last one. What's your bucket list location for getting out in the wild?
I'd quite like to go to Antarctica. Yeah, I haven't been, but yeah, that would be up there, I think.
Oh no, I did miss one question. I lied to you, Andrew. There is one more. When you're out doing field work, what's your essential piece of equipment or clothing or whatever?
Your head torch, I reckon. Always your head torch, yeah, especially because of kakapo, they're nocturnal. But even if not, you don't want to get stuck out. So yeah, I think head torch is up there.
That does seem very essential. Just a question has come to mind based on that. When you're out doing your field work, and you've got your head torch, and you're either grabbing an egg or collecting Jenny Craig information, finding out how your girls are going. How are you recording your observations as you're on the spot? Are you taking notes? Are you doing voice notes, or do you just let the automatically collected information upload into cyberspace?
We still, when we do work with the kakapo field, we're still actually paper based. We still actually do write stuff down. That's kind of changing. I want to switch to a digital system because it's a lot less data handling, a lot quicker and more efficient and stuff. But yeah, we still actually have notebooks, waterproof notebooks. I want stuff down in waterproof notebooks. So still definitely a key role for those. I don't think we'll ever lose them. But yeah, just in terms of just the time that we spend double handling data, I'd like to be able to switch to a digital method.
Fantastic. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for a lot of time out of a busy day, I am sure. We should say Happy World Parrot Day.
Yep,
and,
sure.
Have you got a Kakapo Day? Like,
No, we don't actually. We don't.
Well, we
really
need.
have, I think every day is Kakapo Day. Yeah, no,
Well,
no, we don't. We have, obviously during the breeding seasons and things, and when the chicks, hatch, and that's kind of a key time when we try and get a lot of information out there. But I quite like to try and drip stuff out as well.
Yeah, well, you're really successful getting stuff out on Twitter. I think that, you're one of the best users of Twitter in terms of updating knowledge. But you don't have one sort of key event or anything in New Zealand that is aimed at raising awareness?
No, we don't. We have a Takahe Awareness Month in April. That's just been, but we don't actually do anything like that for Kakapo. But yeah, maybe we should think about it.
Okay, well, after I've called up Jenny Craig and Weight Watchers on your behalf, Andrew, I will. I'll send you over some ideas.
Cool. Well, thanks for solving our problems, Grant.
well, surely there's someone on the marketing team at Mitre 10 who can. I'd love to speak to them and see how they evaluate the involvement. That would be. That would take the thing in a different direction, wouldn't it? But surely they find it worthwhile. And if they find it worthwhile, they should be doing more of it. Yeah.
Yeah, like Woody and one of our partners, they do quite a lot of advocacy, like trying to get the message out there. And that stuff's kind of cool because they reach a different audience to who we would normally reach. So that's actually quite key. Yep.
Well, that's what you always have to do. You have to break out further and further, and every convert can then convert another convert. And that's
right.
Really, really what you need. Population of New Zealand now, Andrew, what is it now?
About 5 million. Still pretty small.
How many of them are in Australia?
Quite a lot of them. Yeah, I'm not sure actually. I thought there was about a million New Zealanders overseas, I think. But
yeah. So you think of a total population about the size of my city. I think what New Zealand have managed to achieve, because your population is decentralized. It's your wild places are a long way from your urban places. I think is leading the way, showing the rest of the world and particularly your neighbours across the ditch how effective things can be. And I wish we had a Department of Conservation that was sort of in control and committed.
Yeah.
It would be great.
We are lucky like that we've got that big organisation working on this and dedicated teams as well. And that's the one thing about we find with the Kakapo and Take. This is not just the last 5 years. This has been going on for decades. And so, we're here today. We've got the reins today, but we're just building on the work of those people who did it in the past. And we're the lucky ones. We get it pretty cushy these days. If you look at the conditions and the jobs and just the rewards, like as well. In the Kakapo breeding season 20, 30 years ago. 2 chicks was a big year, 3 chicks. And then last year we fledged 73 chicks sort of thing. So we're spoiled 70, in terms of.
Did you say 73? Wow.
73. So that was out of 147 adults at the start of that year. So that was, that's the sort of thing that, is really important for us not to forget, is the fact that we're building on that work from all those people who've put the hard yards in the past. And what's strange about the Kakapo as well, we're working with the same individual birds. These individual birds have been around for 30, 40 years. And so we're working with the same individuals that, people 2 or 3 generations of Kakapo workers ago used to work with. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, the work you're doing, standing on the shoulders of giants, that's what we like to say. And, of course, Kakapo are parrots. They're quite big parrots. They're smart parrots. So I see you coming. Oh, here comes Andrew again. How are you, Andrew? In you go. Yeah, how are you? Yeah, I'm sure. Do you ever sense that recognition?
Yeah, we've got some of our team. I'm relatively new to the team. I've only been working for the last 7 years in the team, but there's some of our team who have been working for 20, 30 years, and I'm pretty sure that they know those individuals. In fact, I'm convinced they do. So, yep, just from sight and smell, and yeah,
and mannerisms, the way they
yeah,
carry themselves, all that kind of stuff.
yeah.
Anyone who's had anything to do with parrots knows that they know these things. So
They're clever words. Yeah.
yeah. So thanks, Andrew. Obviously, I want your work to be a great success. It's great that you could mark World Parrot Day with me. We're rushing your episode out so that we catch the tail end of the northern hemisphere or the other side of the world Parrot Day.
Yeah.
But
Cool.
but I hope I can speak to you again. I'm really interested in was it the little spotted kiwi?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
I thought there were 5 kiwi species. Am I correct?
Yep. Yep. That's still currently correct. I think that's
Yep.
might change in future, but
and how many of them are teetering on the brink?
there's probably 3. There's the little spotted kiwi. They're kind of getting out of the woods now. There's the rowie, which is a sort of ocarito brown kiwi on the west coast, and there's a Haas torqueweka, which is another kiwi a bit further south. So those birds are all kind of pretty low numbers in the hundreds.
Well, I'll put you on the spot. Are you up to having a chat about kiwi?
Yeah, we could do it at some point. I'd have to dredge my memory a little bit, and it might be a little bit out of date. Yeah, but yeah.
Okay, well, I'll hit you up for that way down the track. But yeah, we'll put that on the list. I'd certainly like to know a lot more about kiwi myself. So
cool.
Thanks, everybody.
Nice
Dr. Andrew
nice
Digby. Thanks so much. This is the Bird Emergency. Cool. I'm Grant Williams. Thank you for listening. Happy World Parrot Day, everybody.
Cool. Thanks.